and thought-provoking discussions as well. Thanks. So it is now the time to start the last session, session 5 of our symposium, that is entitled Funding and Policies to Support Equity in Genetics and Genomics in Canada. So I would like to invite speakers and panelists and moderators to open your camera. Thank you. So I see that you're all here. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Ms. Trudy Samuel that will moderate this session. Trudy has notable experience in important Canadian agencies and has recently been appointed Director General of Equity Strategy for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Welcome, Trudy.
Thank you, and bon après-midi, Claude, and good afternoon to everyone. A pleasure to be with you this afternoon to have an important conversation about funding and policies to support equity in genomics in Canada. And I'm really quite delighted to be here. As you heard, I'm with the Canadian Institute for Health Research, and this afternoon's conversation, what we really want to do is inform future policies. So the whole point of this conversation is about learning about insights, about tangible tools, mechanisms, and approaches that leverage both funding and policy. Alors, je vous invite de demander vos questions dans la langue de votre choix. I invite you to ask questions in the language of your choice, and we'll support each other. And you know, my nervousness in being in this forum with you is showing. I should have done the right thing first and acknowledge that I'm here on Algonquin traditional territory, acknowledging that Algonquin colleagues have been in this land since time immemorial, and that were they not in that role of looking after this land, I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't be enjoying the benefits of this land. I recognize the work that we need to do, as we've heard this afternoon, to recognize rights holders and all that implies for our work, particularly in health research. So with that, I'd like to quickly move to having a brief presentation from each of our fantastic panelists, beginning with Chris McMaster, who is actually with the CIHR Institute of Genetics. Chris, if you would please get us started with your brief remarks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Trudy. I'm really going to focus on CIHR specifically, and some things CIHR is trying to overtly do to try and address advancing equity in general, but advancing equity in genomics and genetics specifically. So CIHR's new strategic plan has 5 main aims, and I think 3 directly address the issue of advancing equity in genomics and genetics. So 3 out of 5. One is advancing research in all its diversity, and I co-chair that committee. The second is pursuing health equity through research, and the third is accelerating the self-determination of Indigenous peoples in health research. And the main expectations from those are to appropriately address EDI within CIHR staff itself, EDI for researchers trained and researchers funded by CIHR, and EDI on who is researched. That also applies, as I said, as one of the 3 main aims to Indigenous peoples. And then I'm going to drill down a little bit to the Institute of Genetics at CIHR, which has or is undertaking several initiatives that we hope will start to appropriately address what we know are disparities in equity in genomics and genetics. The first that was mentioned, and we're doing this in collaboration with Genome Canada, via their HostSeq project that was run by CGen, which is to start a pan-Canadian human genome library. One of the issues in Canada is we've sequenced several 100,000 or at least 100,000 human genomes or exomes. They're all part of discrete research projects that have done wonderful work. They all have different consents. There's no interoperability. And we have very limited data in Canada on whether or not we're capturing the appropriate diversity required to actually enable what we'd like to see, which is equity in genetics and genomics. So hopefully this library is step one, that we can, with our other funding partners in Canada, help to actually start to address equity in genetics and genomics. The second was a Pan-Canadian Genomics Research Set of Core Elements, which is going to be published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 5 days. That's supposed to enable data sharing while protecting privacy. At the same time, as we'd heard, there are important pieces to actually sharing biobanking and genomics that will require a federated approach. And of course, one of the important pieces to the federated approach is ensuring that Indigenous peoples, which in Canada work under the OCAP principles, which is ownership, control, access, and possession, actually have this incorporated into how biobanking and genomics is being handled. And right now that's being led by the First Nations Information Governance Center, which is going to enable the First Nations people of Canada to determine governance and protocols regarding access to First Nations peoples' biosamples and genomes. And we're funding that, but it's being led by the Institute for Indigenous Persons Health. Also part of the NEARS network, which is the Network for Environments for Indigenous Peoples' Health Research, also led by the Institute for Indigenous Peoples' Health, to work with Canada's Indigenous peoples to develop strategies to strengthen Indigenous research capacity development through training and mentoring. At CIHR, you can actually apply as an Indigenous community or Indigenous community member. You do not have to be associated with any university or hospital research institute, and Indigenous communities can actually hold CIHR research funds themselves. Doesn't matter what your degree is. The nice thing is the review process is also iterative rather than a point in time, so that if your research submission is seen by the committee, which is made up of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous scholars, your response is not a yes or no, it could be a maybe. Here are some things you can do to improve it, so that you can then hopefully build research capacity and research interest within Indigenous communities. What else? We're also working on the Transition to Academia project, which we're co-funding with several institutes, which will provide fellowships for researchers that are underrepresented in academia for both their fellowship, but also their first few years, because where we tend to lose people that essentially are not white, there's the transition from PhD to fellowship to first faculty position. So we're funding their fellowship, we're funding their first few years of salary, but we're also funding their startup. And contributing to their startup when they become new faculty members to try and increase EDI within academia. And finally, within our own institute, we're moving towards more and more overt ways to ensure there's an EDI plan, or if appropriate, an Indigenous persons plan. And that has to be explicit in how it's going to be enabled within our funding opportunities. We were having it as one of several bullet points that we'd like people to address, but we found that's not good enough. So now we're coming up with better strategies to be more overt, more explicit to both the researchers and the reviewers when we actually have this as a criteria. So I'd like to say we're moving in the right direction, lots of work to do.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for that comprehensive overview. It's a great place to start to hear what's going on at CIHR. And next, I'd like to turn to Catalina Lopez-Correa from Genome Canada to provide a little bit of insight from your perspective on those policies and funding opportunities to really reinforce equity. Catalina, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you see me? Okay, Trudy, thank you so much. And thanks, Chris, for this intro. And well, I would just like to start by saying that we have a huge task ahead of us as funding agencies, as policymakers, and organizations that are supporting science in Canada and globally. And when we look at how even the previous panel and the discussions have been going and what challenges we're facing, it is indeed a huge task we had ahead of us. But on the positive side, as Chris, we do have a huge task ahead of us, but we are making some progress. So I will, since we are two of us here from Genome Canada, of course, I'll talk a little bit of the general aspects on programs, and I will let Wesley Oakes, that is with us also from Genome Canada, talk a little bit more of the high level in terms of what we're doing at Genome Canada and how we're advancing our internal roadmap for EDI. So well, first I would say the big news for us is really hiring Wesley, having a person in a small organization like Genome Canada. We're less than 30 people. Genome Canada does a lot of things. I know people think that we might be bigger because we have a lot of programs and we're present in many places. We cover, as you know, not only human health, but we also cover genomics in the agriculture sector, in the climate change, biodiversity. I'll talk a little bit about that. So hiring Wesley is a big advancement for us. Having a person full-time dedicated to the role of advancing equity and Indigenous engagement is big. Now, in terms of the programs, I think what I would like to touch on here is the different fronts where we are trying to develop a strategy. I wouldn't say that we are there. Again, we're not there yet. We are just initially starting to think what are the different activities we can have in terms of our program. So the first one is in outreach. So as soon as we prepare a call for proposals, as soon as we start to outreach and contact the community, we are actively developing programs to really work with universities, work with the genome centers, because as you know, we are the federal representation of this genomic enterprise, but we work in close collaboration with the genome centers across the provinces, and they are the ones that typically are helping prepare some of the projects that will be submitted to Genome Canada for competitions. So working on those elements of drafting the applications and including the language that is a more inclusive language that address equity, diversity, and inclusion, and Indigenous engagement and accessibility also, because for us, we talk about IDEA at Genome Canada, we include always accessibility too. So the outreach is the first component, again, on the fund for proposals and the community work, the meetings, all that we do with the community. The second piece that we're starting to work is for some of our programs, we're starting to talk about co-creation. And in particular, when we talk about Indigenous communities, we're starting a pilot project on a specific funding that will be targeted to, they will be specifically targeted to Indigenous communities and northern communities in Canada. And that initial program will be, we're hoping that we can have a co-creation model where we have some high-level guidance, but we will define, that project will be defined really in a co-creation, and will be the Indigenous communities and northern communities that will define that. The other component, and well, Chris alluded to that, is all our process of review. So one of the core components of what we do at Genome Canada is, of course, our peer review process. And we, again, are working closely with the genome centers. And we clearly know that one process doesn't fit all, but that's the way we have historically functioned. We have one single peer review that we're trying to bring more and more diversity to that peer review. But we're very conscious now that maybe just one single peer review process will not make justice to all type of projects we have. So we're starting to think about what can we do, how can we address those challenges around the peer review. Of course, we are bringing more diversity, more voices, more communities that are underrepresented into our review panels, but we're also thinking more in general what we do and how we do approach those challenges. Now, the monitoring tool. So once a project has been funded, how we address and how we support some of those projects. And I'll give here some examples in particular around the Silent Genome project, specifically on those different items. So for the Silent Genome project, some of you know it is a program, is a project funded in one of our competitions in collaboration with CIHR that was launched in 2017. So I would say the first step and the first learning in that project was to ensure we had Indigenous reviewers in our panel. So that was an initial challenge. We managed to have the reviewers. We couldn't have all the reviewers in the room, which was a challenge, but we managed to get the written reviews and to have those contributions that really fed and informed the review process in a very positive way. Learnings for us in the future, I think, is really bringing those people in person, bringing them really upfront. So second learning from the Silent Genome from a funding perspective, from a funder perspective, is that, of course, the project was launched, was selected for funding by the peer review panel. And when we were starting to negotiate our contract, because we're not a granting agency per se, we do develop contracts with the people we're funding. So when we're starting to develop that contract, we got exactly to the point that was made on the previous panel, which is our contracts say, data has to be open, and you have to share your data, and you have to make your data, all your data available. And that didn't quite work for the Silent Genomes. So we have to go and basically make a different negotiation with the Silent Genomes to ensure we respect data sovereignty, and we respect and we really approach this in a whole different way as compared to our standard contract. So we have to negotiate a very different contract with the Silent Genomes to, again, respect those criteria and those challenges that we face there, and the opportunity also to have one of the, I would say, the largest project we have now in the world, or the second largest potentially, with indigenous in indigenous genomics. And the third piece I will say is, when projects are getting close to an end, we in some cases give the opportunity that what we call no cost extension. So you can extend your project at, we don't give you more money, but you are allowed to work for a little longer in the project while you finish. Well, with the Silent Genomes, we're starting to think, how can we support this no cost extension, acknowledging some of the unique challenges they had as indigenous communities, in particular during COVID. So those are, again, things that I guess we're learning together with the projects. And just to close here, not to make it super long, Trudy, I have been already long enough, but I'll talk about the biodiversity. And in particular, we have now an initiative on climate change and agriculture. And for each of the projects that we are that are in the process of that competition now, we are really inviting and really pushing, in a way, the projects to develop an indigenous engagement strategy. So agriculture, environment, biodiversity, if you think about climate change, has to be done in collaboration with indigenous communities in Canada. And that's, again, a learning for us. We will be able to talk more about that in the next panel next year, or in the next event in a year or two. But again, as Chris say, I think working hard, not yet there, lots of things to do, but very excited to be here and to learn from all and feed into our processes at Genome Canada. Thank you, Trudy.
Oh, thank you so much. Again, a lot to be described. Before we move on to the next panelist, I was just asking myself if everybody around the table has the same understanding of the Silent Genome Project, and if you'd be willing to briefly describe the parameters of what that project is, just to catch people up.
Yeah, well, and I'm not, I'm not the PI. The PI is Dr. Nadine Caron. She is an amazing indigenous genomic scientist up north here in British Columbia. So I'm sure I'm not doing justice to this project, but well, basically, I was actually working with Genome BC at the time when that project was starting to be shaped, and I had the privilege and the honor and the fortune to support that project in their application process. So Silent Genomes is a $10 million large-scale initiative that is really led by indigenous scientist. Nadine Caron is a co-PI, is the co-leader in that project, and she's an indigenous genomic surgeon, medical doctor, and they are working with rare diseases, patients with rare diseases in northern communities in Canada. Now, maybe another learning from that project is that initially we were thinking about the database, the variant database, to capture the variants from indigenous communities. And the initial goal when the project started, when we started to think of, when the PIs started to think about the project, the whole core of the project was the database, the library, let's say. Very quickly, it became super clear that that was really not the core of that project. Now, the core of the project is the governance model, the informed consent, the exchange and information and all the activities they have with the communities to engage the communities in this work around genomics, to educate the communities, to work with the communities, to understand their needs, to understand what is it that they're expecting, and to develop that governance, including all the data sovereignty aspects. So more than just let's get the database, let's get the library that we typically tend to think like, focus on the data, focus on the library. There is all this initial work that is critical. So Silent Genomes has been focusing a lot of that. Of course, they will do at one point, they will do the library, but it's, a lot of the work is more that initial conception of the governance and the informed consent and the engagement with the community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm doing that because I know Dr. Carroll's work is phenomenal, but I didn't want to try to describe it. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Our next speaker is actually going to be Naveed Aziz, CEO of CGen. But thanking you very, very much, Catalina. Naveed, if you would.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Trudy. Just want to start by thanking the organizers for including me in this important discussion on equity in genomics data, something that's really close to my heart. And I've been listening into the previous session, and there was some fantastic discussions, and I felt like just there wasn't enough time. Christina was part of that, and it just kind of almost finished that we could have, or they could have gone on for another 2 hours. It was fascinating. So I'm hoping that Christina will bring some of those discussions into this, be the bridge between the two sessions. So thank you, Christina, in advance for that. So Trudy, what I would like to do in the next few minutes is to just give you my perspective as a fundee. So that's how where I'm a little bit different than the rest of the panel members on why it is important to make sure that we strive towards equity, diversity, inclusion within the genomics research, and hopefully give you a couple of quick insights from what we learned from a recent large-scale genomics project delivered in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was, of course, funded by Genome Canada, and Genome Canada colleagues are here. We've been working very closely with Catalina in the last 2.5 years on that as well. What I hope to provide is some food for thought and discussion points for the audience and the panel members to consider. And hopefully we can talk about more practical steps towards addressing the challenges within the Canadian context. So at a higher level, at a global level, the representation of traditionally underserved groups in genomics research continues to be low, despite the evidence of scientific and clinical need. We know that diversity of genomic data can contribute to understanding differences in the global distribution of disease, better drug prescribing, drug development, reducing misdiagnosis, and perhaps more accurate prediction of disease risk as well. And I can give more specific example of these latter, but especially in the context of impact of funding in supporting equity in these areas. There have been multiple initiatives across the globe to address the lack of representation and of underrepresented population in genomics data, but they all rely on the participation of underrepresented populations to make data and samples available for research and clinical use. And the lack of ancestral diversity in genomics databases could potentially mean that studies based on such data sets may be less able to yield outcomes that are meaningful and transferable for all members of the diverse Canadian population. So in my mind, there's no doubt that success of genomics will surely depend on its ability to deliver improved healthcare across population groups and its acceptance by every member of the population, right? So in specific, in addition to demonstrating clinical utility or cost effectiveness of the genomics research, I think patient involvement and engagement would be key to successful implementation of these services. And I say that from the perspective of what we just saw in the last 2 years. What we observed is that while we were delivering the kind of the largest population-wide genomic project in Canada, where data is openly available to the research community, and the challenges around the willingness to participate in the project depend on a few factors that we observe, right? And I'll just briefly mention a few, and hopefully we'll go into discussions later on these. I think one of them was the familiarity or an engagement experience with genetics and the perception of the power of genetic information. It was also, critical to address the question of trust. And the question of trust is not really how to build trust, but it was more about how to earn the trust and to demonstrate trustworthiness. And another thing we saw was a less commonly acknowledged challenge we experience, and that was of language, again, which is close to my heart as well. It's like people can only meaningfully engage when genomics concepts, ideas, utility can be explained in a way that's easily understandable, right? Whether that is the role of researchers, genetic counselors, or others, but communicating in a linguistically equivalent manner was very important, or is very important. Each of these areas obviously need careful attention and funding support from Genome Canada, CIHR, and others for us to really make progress. So, and I'll leave you with these few points that what we saw in the last 2 years within the pandemic constant were challenges around the pressing need for data to inform the pandemic response, which actually meant that we had limited time and resources for engaging education activities. For example, the indigenous communities, and Catalina and I and a few others, we were closely involved in talking to Laura Arbor, Nadine Caron, and others in the indigenous community to try and help the process. But the time constraints obviously were limited, which really translated into a lack of well-defined data related to the underrepresented groups, which may now inhibit the identification of solutions and therapies that are more specific to these groups, right? We also learned that there is a defined need to proactively build relationship to understand the challenges in how to involve underrepresented groups when it comes to large-scale genomics data and research. And we in Canada, as a collective, I think, must continue to advocate for large-scale genomic data generation and sharing at a scale that will enable research that benefit all Canadians. And of course, again, I will finish by saying that all of the above require commitment. And it's not just about the dollar value, it's the commitment from the funder. It's what Chris was talking about, it's what Catalina was talking about. I'm sure it's what Wesley will talk about in a second, is the commitment and understanding and acknowledgement that we all have to kind of work on this at a collective level, not in the context of, oh my God, we have a pandemic, we're producing this data set, we need to include everybody. The approach needs to me, the EDI approach in everything we do is not a pillar. It's a foundation that all the pillars need to stand on. I'll stop here, Trudy, and I'm sure we'll talk about the rest of it later.
Well, I certainly imagine that we will, Naveed, as you've thrown the gauntlet to Christina, and I anticipate that you might get that right back. But in the interim, Wesley, I noted that you came on screen. Perhaps you wanted to provide some other perspectives from a Genome Canada, just tagging on to Catalina. Would that be the best thing to do now?
Yeah, that's fine. That's great. Thanks, Trudy. Thanks, everyone. I want to start with a few acknowledgements. I'm joining you right now on the territory protected and cared for by the Ganahaka Kahaka Nation. I'm here on the island of Shoshone, so it's a pleasure to be here. And I also want to acknowledge the organizers and sponsors for convening us in a really trailblazing way. To have these very critical conversations about diversity, inclusion, and equity in ways that I don't believe have happened before. So this on its own is certainly a sign that there is energy in the community and a desire to do better than what we are currently doing. And that is inspiring. And I just want to add to that, the critical thinking that has emerged here, really deep stuff, is especially inspiring. What I want to do is maybe just provide a flavor, a very high level overview of some of the basic things that we are thinking about as an organization in terms of really improving our processes. But I also want to begin by saying that we are learning. And so our role here today as part of this conversation is to hear what's going on in the community and to really get a better sense of what the issues are, how folks are approaching this, so we can go back and think about this and come up with some of our own solutions. So we haven't figured this out, right? That is my message, but we are certainly determined to do better. My framing has always been when we entered this particular conversation is to recognize, yes, gender and racial disparities and inequities in the Canadian ecosystem have a detrimental impact, obviously, on Indigenous, Black, racialized people, those living with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ communities. This we know, it's well established. The impact, though, is far-reaching, and it's not just a clinical impact or inability to make sense or develop genomic technologies to address rare disease, for example, but the impact is one that is a critical loss to Canadian innovation and science, the quality, relevance, and impact of research. So here what I'm trying to complicate is this idea that equity and science are two separate domains, right? And that equity is something that we can do independent of science itself. And that is not correct, right? The inequities and disparities in our system not only limit the social and scientific discovery that we can achieve, but really foreclose other ways of knowing, inhabiting, and interacting with and in the world. Essentially, it prevents us from asking different questions. In other words, these disparities limit the plane of how we think and practice science and limit our ability to respond to socio-environmental and health issues that grip us today, right? And so the bigger picture here is we need to create space to change the way in which we see and understand and exist in this world, and to do so requires us to create pathways. So what are some of the things that we are working on as an organization? Well, I'm going to highlight 3 of them, and I'm going to start with our desire now to really begin to collect demographic information around not only our applicant researchers, our active researchers, but also to retrospectively look back and better understand who we're funding. We need to know who we are as an ecosystem, and collecting demographic information is really key to doing that. And what I'm talking about here is self-identified information, both on race and Indigenous identity, but also other markers of identity, and of course, in a way that is voluntary and within a context of informed consent. We plan to do this, as I said, not only with funded researchers, but also with our peer reviewers, and also internally as an organization to make sure that we are providing, we are attracting and retaining diverse talent, and that we are able to promote that talent as well and create a safe environment for the enterprise. The second thing I want to highlight, actually, as part of this data piece, is that we're also very keen to make sure that we are standardizing our data categories right across the enterprise, that we are collecting or using the same categories and using the same response rules in collecting this information. So that's also very important. 2, we're practicing or want to practice, develop a culture, enculturate perhaps is the better word, equity by design. And what I mean by equity by design is really ensuring that our programs of research and innovation are informed by the needs and priorities of community and right holders, right, disproportionately impacted by the health, and inequities, right? Making sure that when we are trying to fund and develop solutions, that those communities are really providing the parameters for how we do that research. So that's one level, and we're certainly committed to creating, again, pathways to doing this, making sure that we are compensating people for their time and their wisdom, making sure that we recognize the social context in which communities live, meeting them where they are. But we also want to ensure that these considerations around equity are built into our protocol process. And what I mean by that is that when we're funding researchers, that researchers are expected from the jump to be able to answer questions around equity. Therefore, in their methodology and their data analysis plan, that they've considered issues around equity. And this would, of course, translate to our adjudication process, We're, ensuring that we have a diverse set of reviewers with the capacity to engage around equity, but also to use criteria, equity-based criteria to make sense and adjudicate. So these are things that we certainly will continue to work on moving forward, and the community can expect from us. And I think third, the last piece here, and very briefly, is around really positive designation. And this is really in the spirit of equity itself. It's a piece here around us exploring protected envelopes within fixed totals for Indigenous, Black, and racialized people, those living with disabilities, and members of LGBTQ2. And so this is a very targeted approach to ensuring that underrepresented researchers, members of the community, are getting funded, echoing, pieces that were already said in previous sessions around ensuring that, hey, eligibility is open, that we're not just funding individuals that have a PhD necessarily. We're not necessarily looking for particular kinds of institutional affiliations, but beyond that, exploring, different types of models of funding, perhaps less restrictive, more flexible timelines, different types of reporting. So these are the things that we will be looking certainly very closely at as we move forward in developing our roadmap. Over to you, Christina, or Trudy.
I was just going to say thank you so much, Wesley. A really comprehensive picture, and also informing the policy approach and frame it and mindset brought to the work. So thank you for that. A perfect compliment. Christina, we've bought you some time to reflect on the linkage between the previous session and this session here. And I hope you'll be able to do that along with introducing some of your thinking that you have going on at this time, considering funding. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks so much for the opportunity to continue the conversation and be part of this wonderful roundtable and group of esteemed Canadian colleagues. I am gonna build upon Naveed, what my colleague Vince Bonham spoke about in the prior session about what's happening at the National Institutes of Health and the National Human Genome Research Institute in the United States with regards to funding and policies to support equity in biomedical research, and then specifically within my institute in the fields of genetics and genomics. So mostly everyone knows this, but a little over 2 years ago, many Americans, particularly those who identify as white, began really reckoning with issues of racism happening within the United States in a deeper way than probably ever before. And, of course, racism and stark health inequities were realities for Indigenous people, people of color, LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities in the United States. They've experienced that their entire lives for centuries. But I would say that 2020 was sort of a tipping point, and it kind of pushed NIH forward and NHGRI to begin looking inward at ourselves and outward as to what could be done to dismantle structural racism in biomedical research, and then for obviously in the Genome Institute, structural racism that was happening in genetics and genomics. And then to also look at how to enhance the diversity of the genomics workforce so it was representative of the United States, and how to improve equity in health and healthcare. So as Vince said, NIH put the Unite initiative into effect in 2021. That was very big for NIH. Never before had the words, at least to my knowledge, been used about racism and structural racism in such a strong way. And so that there's 80 people, staff members that are working on that, 1,000 public comments that came in. It was just a very powerful initiative that continues today. And then at the same time, NHGRI was putting forth a strategic vision in 2020 that we've been working on for a couple of years, and then the diversity action agenda followed in 2021. But all of these documents, acknowledged the impact of structural racism in the biomedical field, the lack of diversity in the biomedical workforce, the lack of diversity in genomic data sets, and the absolute need for change, that we could not do things the same way anymore. We needed to change. And so as new policies were being developed and new initiatives were being developed and new funding mechanisms are being developed, all of these areas, community outreach and engagement was absolutely key to developing these policies, these initiatives, these funding programs. So I'm hopeful to use my time today in our discussion to talk about our experiences and approaches in those areas, and also the role that community outreach and engagement played in all of them.
Well, thank you so much for that. Something to look forward to, certainly. But before we go there, what I'd like to ask is a little bit about going further. How are you working to ensure those EDI, those equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations? I'm going to ask the whole panel this question. How are you making these things become a reality, both in the projects as well as in the research teams? How those two, because we heard a lot about projects, but a little more tangibility about the research teams would be helpful. I'm not sure, Christina, if you want to speak to that first, or if there are others. Be happy to entertain two panelists that would like to speak to that question.
I'm happy to begin with just a little bit, and then send it over to my colleagues for follow-up. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about internal, because I think that part of what we needed to do and what the Unite initiative told us we needed to do was that there are 27 institutes and centers that make up the NIH. So the Genome Institute is just one of them. So most of them are disease specific, and we're disease agnostic genome. But every institute and center was challenged to develop a racial and ethnic equity plan that looked at our internal to how we were going to dismantle structural racism and increase diversity within our own institutes. And I think it was very different process than anyone had ever done before. It was a short period of time, and it brought together people from across the institute to really think about these issues, because I feel like we needed to get ourselves on the right track internally in order to start developing policies and programs and funding mechanisms that we're going to also tackle these issues. So that I would say was, these racial and ethnic equity plans that are not public just yet, but have metrics and action items associated with it, and we're being measured against it, and people are really taking it seriously, and has made a lot of people optimistic when many of these things that we've done before have not really gone anywhere, to be truthful. I feel a little bit different about this, and I think a lot of people do. So I think that was another thing. And then also, we began inviting people to the table, institutions to the table, that had never been invited to the table before, particularly minority serving institutions. So we had done within the Genome Institute, a portfolio analysis, and it was brought forth, not that we didn't know this, but it was brought forth to leadership that we had not funded a minority serving institution, a historically Black college, a tribal college, a Hispanic serving institution in the past 10 years. That's a problem. So we decided at the Training, Diversity, and Health Equity Office that Vince Bonham runs, that I'm a part of, is that we were going to bring research intensive historically Black colleges and then Hispanic serving institutions to the table, because we had developed a funding opportunity for diversity genome centers. That's just kind of amazing. One of my colleagues has put this together, and we wanted them to know about it and to be successful and be able to realize that they could come to speak with the program officer to get guidance. Everyone got some guidance, but you could get guidance to be successful in these things. So we had brought people to the table as a milestone. Our director came on and said, this is the first of many conversations. So I think we started to put these things in effect where we were engaging with communities and doing outreach to communities for these institutions in unique ways. So that's my one example, and I'll let my other colleagues speak to it.
Wow, thank you so much. It appears that early socialization and engagement, along with the commitment from the organization to make this happen, even at a more granular team level, was an important factor. Catalina, I believe I saw your hand up, but perhaps.
Yeah, it was there and I'm ready to comment. So thank you, Trudy. Absolutely. So I just give also a couple of examples. And again, this is a process we're just starting. So what we're working and developing now with Wesley is basically an initial equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility strategy for Genome Canada. And that has been presented, that contains like the high level strategy and contains also a roadmap or what are some of the initial actions that we can start taking in our programs. And I can give a couple of examples of the actions, and actually Wesley already gave a couple. But this roadmap and well, the initial strategic plan has been presented initially to our staff because, you know, a big component also is to educate our internal people at Genome Canada on the importance, on the need to ensure we advance this. So that has been a big component of what we're doing, educating our group at Genome Canada, educating our stakeholders in a way, and work with the genome centers, as I mentioned before. And on that, we have the roadmap that is starting to develop concrete initiatives like, you know, capturing the data, the demographic data on who has been funded historically by Genome Canada. We don't even have that data. We haven't not been historically collecting demographic data to see who applies, who's funded, who's not funded. And reaching out a little bit what you say, Christina, we have been also very active or trying to be much more active than we were before in reaching out to specific groups. And I want to mention here one of my colleagues, Coco, that is attending this webinar here today. She organized a couple of months ago, webinar with Indigenous genomic leaders in Canada and around the world. So bringing those voices together and bringing these people together to talk about genomics, so that was an incredible experience where a lot of people from Canada could, contribute, participate. We had also another webinar with Black scientists in genomics, and that was part of a larger activity with Black science, but bringing the Black scientists in genomics, that's another. So reaching out again to those communities, so the outreach component, the education component, and our program component are three pieces that we're trying to work. Baby steps, I will say baby steps.
Oh, thank you so much, Catalina. There was a lot there. I saw lots of reaction. Perhaps we can go to Naveed and then Chris, and then we'll move on to the next question. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Trudy. I'll be quick. I resisted the temptation to jump in, but I think I will very quickly, just because my two colleagues have provided some fantastic points. And I just your question was building the research around research teams and equity in research teams. A couple of examples from our end. We have a recently funded again by Genome Canada, thank you, the Biogenome project that involves sequencing the biodiversity within Canada, and some of that biodiversity needs to be captured from the Arctic and from northern areas. And the reason I want to jump in was to acknowledge what Christina just said is inclusion of those discussions and those involvements right up front, right from the beginning, and not as an afterthought, as a tick box that's saying, well, we need somebody from that area too. Acknowledging very quickly that if we were going to achieve a true Canadian, capture the true Canadian diversity, we will need to engage people who are really, who know what they're doing in those areas, and who are practicing that and acknowledging their expertise and their space in that. So that is very important. And the other example, similarly, Chris mentioned the human genome or genome library, Canadian Genome Library that CIHR has just launched in partnership with Genome Canada and CGen. And again, the conversations around inclusion of data sets from underrepresented communities, from the Indigenous community, have started now, not at a later stage. And in the other previous panel, Christina, we're talking about federated data sets and data in one place. And all of those discussions, you can't fix those at a later stage when you build something and then you're trying to, put a round peg in a square hole. You have to start the discussions today, so you know that the backbone of everything you do and what you're creating has the ability to provide those checks and balances, those other kind of gatekeeping processes for the data sets that involve that, and having the ability of federate that to a point where it's possible to include them, leaving control within the individuals that should have control. So just acknowledging that those discussions right from the beginning, right at the front end, are important. We've seen people try to do it at a later stage. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Thank you.
Chris, just before you go to answer, I'm wondering if you can talk to us about the funding and policy framework in place for those early interventions, those early opportunities that Naveed mentioned, along with your input on the question, of course. I'm stacking up.
Sure. I would say I've been a scientific director at CIHR for 4 years now for the Institute of Genetics, is that CIHR writ large, I think, just came up with its strategic plan, 2021. And equity, diversity, and inclusion, and research excellence and knowledge diversity are two out of the four major drivers, along with Indigenous peoples' health research and self-determination. That's great. That said, it's only in the last couple of years have we even been tracking, as Catalina pointed out, who do we fund? And then also, what's even harder, who are we researching? Are we researching the appropriate people, the appropriate amount of time? And that's something I don't think we're keeping track of yet at all. It's harder to do as well, but I don't think it's something we do. And then in addition, CIHR is kind of weird in that we're a grants model. We give money out and then we let people do what they want with it. That's just the way we're essentially, we have to do it. That's how we're legislated to do it. But it doesn't mean we can't ask. We can't mandate, but we can definitely ask people to come back and say, so, what has been the fruits of your labors? And in addition, I think we have to be much more overt, because right now, and I gave a blurb at the very beginning of this conference on the peer review panel and folks that got some money. And we had one of the 5 points, please address EDI as part of your research proposal. And the 3 teams that got funded did not address EDI as part of the research proposal. And when I asked them why, they said, well, whenever we put in EDI, we always get pinged by the peer reviewers, which tend to be academics, for saying it's going to complicate the data analysis. It's going to cost more money. It's going to take longer. So why would you want to bother doing that when you can do it faster, easier, cheaper on this huge database of white people? So that is clearly an issue, right? And there's some education that needs to take place. And I think we need to be much more overt as a funder in terms of our policies to reward people who include EDI. And I think we need to do that, make it clear to the applicants, but also the peer reviewers. But they're the same folks by and large in Canada, because almost everybody who applies is a peer reviewer. So I think we need to make it incredibly overt versus one of a few dots and have it as a hunk of policy. I think we need to have a much stronger language in everything we do at CIHR when it comes to this, even if it's a box that has to be inserted, like our sex and gender box has been inserted. We don't want a proliferation of boxes when it comes to research excellence. We need to pick the ones that are most important, but I think this is clearly one of the most important that should become a box that, if appropriate, are you addressing EDI in your research? If yes, how? And if no, why not?
Well, thank you so much. And full disclosure, everyone, I've been with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research since the 19th of September. So I'm learning from you and very appreciative, Chris, of what you're describing. In fact, yesterday just did a whole session learning about inclusive research excellence, which in fact marries the notions of EDI and research excellence and the work that we're going to do to get there. So thank you for that. Well, you've said some really interesting things about how we're doing and its impact. And I see we've got a question in the chat. Specific to the Canadian context, Canadian granting agencies are asking researchers to develop EDI plans. I think it aligns quite well, but we don't have good Canadian data to inform such plans. What is your advice to researchers for finding this data? And do you have resources and initiatives to help them? Thank you, Heather, for the question. Who would like to address it?
I will start tentatively. I would say as part of your research plan, accumulating the EDI data that's necessary can be part of the research plan. I think as a funder, we need to actually know that that's an important part of the research plan. In the absence of data, we got to go get the data. So I think gathering this data appropriately, safely, doing no harm, et cetera, and having a plan around that can certainly be part of the research proposal. And I would encourage folks to include those in those. And Trudy, I know we're going to be talking quite a bit more about this in my co-chairing role of what we call Priority Steering Committee A on advancing research and all its excellence at CIHR and all its diversity at CIHR, in terms of how to ensure that, you know, this looking at EDI itself as a research question is important.
Thank you so much. We've just got 3 minutes left, which means that we're having a lightning round and where you're going to use as few words as possible to address this question. So how are you responding when the perception of harm comes from the dominant community? From the community that sees itself as the majority, but is not the object of positive designation, as Wesley described. How are you responding to the backlash where people say they're being excluded?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know it certainly brings up narratives around reverse racism. But what's important, I think, is that as we address these issues, we address them collectively in a transparent way. We make sure that the expectations are very clear early on. That we continue to have dialogue around these pieces. Trudy, the reality is that there is no simple solution to this. I think we have to come together and have consensus that this is something that we want to do. And I do believe that the data does support why this is important. And there is certainly traction now, and it's time.
And Trudy, I can just add a couple of quick points here, as you said, lightning round. So I think among other factors, as we talked about and others can do, is one of the main factors that account for this is the lack of trust in the research community. And then the limited diversity within the research community, which we didn't get a chance to talk about today. And I think building trust come from engagement with the underrepresented communities, and the lack of engagement of traditionally scientifically underrepresented groups can only be better addressed by culturally and linguistically appropriate engagement practices. I think that will be key to some of these progress and activities.
Find that I can take a few more moments. Anybody want in on the lightning round here? It's a tough question. All right, then. We will leave it at that. I wanted to speak to the notion, I think where you were going, Wesley, first was about acknowledging and anticipating that it's going to come, because your organization is preparing for such possibilities. So you're in state of readiness. I want to wrap by saying I thank you very much. This is just a taste of both the experience and the expertise that's around the table. But I'm really grateful to have supported it in a way that I could as moderator, and appreciate what each of you brought to the table. Would love an hour conversation at least with each of you, one by one. Claude, I put it in your hands again. Thank you again.
Thank you, Trudy, and thank you all panelists for this amazing roundtable. And as Trudy say, we could definitely hear you another hour completely to hear about all the incredible initiatives that you're putting. I think this is really a testimony of how founder and policymaker in Canada are really leading the way to support equity in genomics. And I really appreciate how you're committed to the cause and already implementing changes in funding and policies. So our symposium is now getting to its end. So I'd like to invite the organizing committee members to open your videos for the closing remarks, if agreeable with you. Well, no obligation, but I would like you to open your camera so I can thank you. Thanks to Yvonne Bombard, Sally Farran, Jennifer Fishman, François Gros-Louis, Julie Christophe, Claire Lemoine, Christopher McMaster, Vincent Mouser, Herman Naveed, Angie Nee, and Etienne Richer. Thanks for your contribution to planning and organizing this symposium. And I would add an extra thanks to Claire Lemoine, who managed the logistics aspects of the symposium. I would also, yeah. Thanks also to graduate students who contributed as well to the virtual event. Thanks Susanna, who's here, sat there with us, and Peyton McClellan. Please let me give a few other thank you notes before hearing the closing remarks from Dr. Christopher McMaster and Vincent Mouser. First, I'd like to thank our keynotes, invited speakers, panelists, and moderators for sharing your perspectives and learnings on how to advance equity in genomics, both to promote innovative research, but also ultimately to improve the health of all. The past 2 days have been truly inspiring. Importantly, I would like to thank all the participants. With 300 persons registered from around the world and more or less 100 participants present at each session, you demonstrate the interest for advancing genomics health equity in worldwide populations and in Quebec and Canada. We have welcomed participants from all Canadian provinces with representatives from academia, industry, and as you saw, also policymakers and founders. Thank you for your participation. The goal of our symposium was to create a space to discuss equity, diversity, inclusion in genomics research in Quebec and Canada. I think we can say that the first edition of our symposium this week really succeeded in creating an amazing momentum. We are looking forward to follow-up initiatives, so please stay tuned. This event would not have been possible without the support of multiple institutions. So thanks, Genome Canada. Thanks, Genome Quebec, for your support. And most importantly, thanks to the host of the symposium, the McGill CERC program in Genomic Medicine and the CIHR Institute of Genetics. So let me please invite now Christopher McMaster, Scientific Director of the CIHR Institute of Genetics, to give his closing remarks. Chris.
Thank you so much, Claude. And I think we need to thank the person who did all the thanking, Claude Barrère, as well, because she did so much work and was definitely, I think, the heavy lifter when it came time to much of this conference. So thank you so much, Claude. I'm just going to give some reflections, I think, that I've heard that I hope resonate with folks. I think there's, from where I sit, including and ensuring EDI and Indigenous peoples in genetics and genomics research makes for better research in general. I think there's a pervasive thought out there that complicating databases by adding folks that are not highly represented in the current databases makes for research that takes longer and costs more money. And I think research itself is starting to show that that's not true at all. And actually increasing the EDI and increasing the participation of Indigenous peoples actually makes for better research. And I think funders themselves, publishers, societies certainly should and could and will be playing a major role in enabling and ensuring EDI and Indigenous people's rights are appropriately prioritized and rewarded when actually we're looking to give out funds or publish papers. And then finally, I think, one of the things we've talked about that I think is when we're looking at databases, we want to make sure they're appropriately populated with the populations that should be there. And even if we think we have the perfect database, We've done everything right, thank goodness. There's still biases that need to be guarded against when analyzing these large data sets, especially when you start to parse the data set. And you've taken all of the EDI and Indigenous rights considerations into account, you think you can. So then we've got to be especially conscious of these biases as we're moving forward. And this is especially important when you start to transition research into clinical care, because in the end, we want to make sure we minimize harm and we do as much good as possible. So I think all those are things that we need to ensure is there. I will say inequities in research lead to inequities in care, and the job of all of us, and this is very apparent in genomics itself, is to ensure that these inequities are minimized and hopefully down the road is eliminated as best we can. I'm done.
Thank you, Chris. I guess I have the last word. The first thing, I was coming here with high expectations, and je ne suis pas déçu. I'm just very pleased with these 2 days. I learned a whole lot. I enjoyed so much actually listening to people. I mean, really, j'étais sidéré par certaines présentations. I really enjoyed them. Not to say as well all the pleasure of meeting face-to-face the organizing committee here and thanking these people from coming here to Montreal. I've seen as well how timely our meeting has been, and I've been also thinking about maybe another problem which we are creating. That means we have been discussing about discrimination against people based on their sexual orientation, their gender, whether they live urban or rural. But what will happen when genetics will come up with new classifiers, people with very low educational attainment, people with very high polygenic risk for Alzheimer's and this type of thing. So I'm so glad that we're tackling these very heavy problems right now, and look forward to seeing next steps, but also seeing practical ways to address these issues that we have been discussing. I cannot commit to anything but ensure you all that we'd like to continue this conversation. We would love to contemplate a second meeting of that nature. We have had some preliminary discussions here with Chris, with Etienne Richer as well. We sense some support from the IRSC, CIHR for that. I'd like to discuss here with the committee which has put in place this meeting and our sponsors before we, of course, make any announcement. Finally, again, let me thank you all for your attendance. Let me thank the speakers. Let me thank our sponsors. Let me thank Claude again, because she did the heavy lifting. It was very nice for me to sort of be on the passenger seat. And I wish you all the very best and look forward to seeing you again. So again, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.